So here's the essay that is the prologue to my memoir. It's titled Inclusion at Hellfire Corner. There's a footnote on the title, which is on Hellfire Corner. During the Great War, British soldiers first gave the name Hellfire Corner to the intersection of the Menin Road and the Ypres Railway, a mile outside Ypres, Belgium, which was a salient on the Western Front. Because German gunners and spotters were able to use the intersection as a convenient targeting point, it was said to be the most dangerous place in the world at the time. And in the Second World War, the British continued this naming tradition for good reason at Dover, just 20 miles northwest of Ypres as the bomber flies, just 70 miles northwest of Ypres as the bomber flies, when the Germans once again reached the British with their guns, this time as they shelled and bombed a natural salient land formation, the whole Kentish corner of England. Here's the epigraph. I confess I do not believe in time. I like to fold my magic carpet, after use, in such a way as to superimpose one part of the pattern upon the other. Let visitors trip, and the highest enjoyment of timelessness in a landscape selected at random is when I stand among rare butterflies and their food plants. This is ecstasy, and behind the ecstasy is something else, which is hard to explain. It is like a momentary vacuum into which rushes all that I love, a sense of oneness with sun and stone. Vladimir Nabokov from Speak Memory. 1 year before his death, an ancient man with military posture wearing Jay Gatsby's white dinner jacket approached me during a church coffee hour in Wichita, Kansas. I had been making idle chatter with a man a few decades younger who used the same strawberry blonde hair dye as his wife, about my traveling and camping in England. But once the strawberry blonde man shifted the conversation to explaining why he kept a loaded pistol in his nightstand to shoot potential intruders, likely blacks and Hispanics, he said, because they are inherently more violent, and any intruder, he had to assume, could only mean him harm. I was glad for the interruption and turned to him. "Dover, you say?" The voice belonged to an Englishman. "I served King George VI in the tunnels below the cliffs, in those chambers." He extended a hand. "The name's Harrison, Frederick Harrison." He smiled as I introduced myself and tried bodily not to exclude the potential intruder-shooter. Harrison's white pencil mustache tracing his lip curled up, and his eyes actually twinkled. As he spoke, I feared he would correct my English trivia or the more glaring oversights found in my slim experience, but instead he brought us to the Second World War. As if beating a boat against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past, he stretched out the arms of his dinner jacket to grab imaginary oars. Or handlebars, it turned out, pantomiming the proper way to execute a formal dismount from a military motorcycle. "This procedure one does whilst moving," he said, eyes wide. "One stands up on the motorbike's pegs, shoves the handlebar clear to the left lock, and sends the motorcycle catapulting away from him. He lands on his 2 feet, stands upright, and salutes." I envied his life immediately. Hand at his brow, he then remembered why he wanted to talk about Dover. His eyes narrowed as he lowered his voice. He looked like the love child of Vincent Price and Winston Churchill. "Right before I was to go to London on leave, we had the most dreadful artillery barrage. When the German forces reached that sliver of French land on the horizon, they began to fire these great big shells at us. Then they were landing them in the harbor, and the place shook like you wouldn't believe, booming and crashing even underground." Harrison counted down the hours until he could escape to London. The Battle of Britain had begun. Control of the English Channel and of virtually all Allied shipping convoys to London was at stake, and they needed to ward off a potential German invasion. In August 1940, the British were still scrambling to install their own cross-channel artillery in response to the ever-increasing Nazi guns in France. At that point in Cap Gris-Nez, they consisted of Siegfried batteries, gun firing 15-inch diameter shells, along with the 4 11-inch guns of Grosser Kurfürst, and all 25 of the Nazis' railways guns, 7 of which could only be used against land targets, while 18 of them could take pot shots at any shipping through the channel. In retaliation to the Germans' August 22 shelling of an Allied forces shipping convoy sailing through the Dover Strait, the British had only one gun that could shoot across the channel, a 14-incher named Winnie, after Churchill. Weeks later came Pooh, the second and final cross-channel gun. Just weeks before, at the Battle of Dunkirk, the Allied forces, mostly British, had to abandon nearly all their weapons and materiel in France while retreating in order to facilitate the miracle 9-day evacuation of 338,226 soldiers. Along with the 68,000 men lost, killed, wounded, or captured, they had to leave behind 2,472 guns, 20,000 motorcycles, and almost 65,000 other vehicles. Luckily for the British back across the Channel, massive guns were not their only defense. Royal Air Force pilots fought the bulk of the battle high above their heads, with Hurricanes and Spitfires, and most importantly, detecting the Luftwaffe's raids with the help of Chain Home, the early warning radio detection finding system, known today as radar. Often the shelling was constant, and Chain Home was useless against shells. You could only hear the shell whistle if it passed overhead. The whistle was shorter the closer it landed, and the shell that landed right on top of you, you'd never hear coming. So Harrison's days and nights at Hellfire Corner cycled between annoyance and terror. The closer the shells landed, the more they shook the chalk cliffs. The tunnels ran deep, but never seemed deep enough. And how substantial was a bunker made of chalk anyway? Easy to dig, yet easier to destroy? There should be a proverb about tunneling through chalk, the wise man against the fool. It took 25 fools of the Royal Marine Siege Regiment just to operate those 2 big guns on the far side of St. Margaret's, to cart each shell and its cordite charge on rails to feed Winnie and Pooh from their respective magazine rooms, and then from a remote fire control room to make them heave and hoe. Thus, amidst the shelling, the constant air raid alerts throughout the war, there would be 3,059 of them in Dover alone. And what with the power and lights going off and on, Fred Harrison didn't get a wink of sleep. When the possibility of sleep was out of the question, and there was an hour or so to go until he would be released, Harrison walked down the series of tunnels to the lavatory to prepare for his leave, to shave, wash up, and whatnot. While he unpacked his DOP kit, the lights went out again. The afterimage of the lavatory dwindled on his retinas, and he searched it vainly for details as it faded. Where had he set what? He stooped, reached, and knocked the lather brush to the floor. It clacked and rolled somewhere. He cursed himself for not bringing a light. How long would he have to wait for the lights to come on? Hours? Days? It must have been near dawn or past it, but of course the sun wouldn't help him down here. He couldn't wait, or he'd miss his train, and he couldn't just leave without a shave, returning home to his wife and baby daughter like some unkempt mongrel alley dog. That would be a victory for the Krauts. He pawed around the edges of the sink basin for his razor, the rest of his kit, and for anything to cure him of the darkness. Nearly all the brains of the military system were shunted down into those tunnels, 3 miles of them, crammed with communication switchboards and endless runs of wire. The radar towers they'd been erecting since '38 stood all along the coast and buzzed their signals outward to sea, to bounce back to the receiving antennas, where the signals were taken up, processed, called in by operators down into tunnels in unison, collated in the underground telephone exchange, all cabled and bundled together. Maybe it was best, then, to think of the tunnel network as partly human, sheathed and protected nerve bundles that converged from the reaches of England's body to this spinal cord of awareness, a system feeling blindly, even in the dark, sensing the flocks and swarms of German planes at the horizon before they could ever be heard. As he listened now, he heard a far-off scuttle of feet, doors shutting, and low voices. Fred hollered and listened to his echoed voice recede, turn strange, hollow. Again he called. To his right, a tap dripped. No answer. It was a failure of his personal radar, or supersonics, or ASDIC. It's ASDIC. Whatever they would call his science of listening, this science of listening, of sense, of what would come next on a human scale. Taking the razor in one hand, he unfolded it gently with the other. Here is where the magic carpet folds as well, superimposing its patterns, one on top of the other. The fold traps Harrison in the dark tunnels for a moment, clutching a freshly stropped straight razor pointed at his neck, perhaps testing where to cut. Over 60 years later, and over 60 feet above Harrison, on the top side of this carpet fold, on top of the cliffs, my own face was freshly shaved. Shaving while camping on the cliffs presented a challenge, though one not nearly as difficult as doing so in a dark wartime tunnel. So I opted to shave and shower at the Dover YMCA, from where I had just returned. I must admit that I sat not directly above those secret wartime tunnels in which Harrison had worked and I had toured, but on the cliffs with gun emplacements at the far side of the harbor, providing a better view of the ships and Dover Castle. The proximity is close enough, I hope, to superimpose one part of my life onto Harrison's pattern. In that spring of 2004, after completing a term at Oxford University, I continued pretending to be an English gentleman by embarking on a grand tour, which in my case meant taking the second-hand bicycle that I'd bought outside the Student Union and pedaling south, first to Reading and Plymouth, then taking a train east to London and Dover, after which I would cross the English Channel aboard a ferry to Calais and cycle onwards, deeper into continental Europe, until the end of time and money. That particular day had marked likely the third one I'd spent at Dover, with my tent staked on a grassy outcropping above one of the gun turret emplacements of St. Martin's Battery, relishing the luxury of my lookout over the harbor, my open rainfly vestibule, sheltering my hiking boots and camping stove from the misty rain, while I indulged myself with a book, sitting on my sleeping bag, and gazing beyond the arcing shoreline's reach of white cliffs and straight out to the crust of French horizon. My tent's vivid yellow rainfly was likely to attract attention, but I figured I was far enough away from the main paths to be left alone. St. Martin's three-gun battery was first built of brick in 1870, housing cannons to defend the harbor against French ships, and it was reworked in 1940 against the Germans. I'm skipping a section. In military terms, despite the missing guns, it would have been a superior position to send to sight and fend off climbing, invading foot soldiers, but I should not have felt so confident, so removed from the perils of invasion. I had hardly seen a soul all the days I had been there, until, as I stared out into the harbor, at docking ships, wheeling seagulls, and glanced back at my book, I heard, "Ahoy! Ahoy there!" A voice, all too jovial, called from the path maybe 20 yards away. It came from a man wearing a backpack. Without thinking much, and possibly enjoying the misty weather as much as he, I decided to hail him back. "Ahoy!" I said, raising my steel mug of coffee in his direction. I think I meant to well-wish his well-wishing spirit. He marched onward at a conspicuously slow pace. I returned to reading a short story, advancing a couple more pages. "I say, ahoy!" He was back at it. This time I looked more carefully to see him paused on the path below, twirling a twiggy branch with eerie radial brachiate symmetry, spinning it intently on its axis with his fingers, back and forth, like the brass ball counterweights of a mantel clock, keeping time. His backpack resembled that of a schoolchild, a bright variety of simple colors, and a bit too small. The sky sprinkled more deliberately than the day's earlier mist. The man looked my way but didn't rest his gaze, shyly panning his head about him as if checking for street signs or dock numbers, like the way a cat sniffs at random foliage to pretend indifference while edging closer to prey. I decided not to encourage him this time. I had an odd feeling. Like the cliffs around us, this man appeared to be a few guns short of a proper artillery emplacement. "Ahoy, Captain!" There was almost a question in his voice, like he needed a captain and was looking for one, just as the gray, knob-headed baby bird from P.D. Eastman's children's book, Are You My Mother?, hatches from his yellow egg and searches high and low for his worm-fetching mother, systematically interviewing a kitten, hen, dog, cow, car, tugboat, 4-engine airliner, and finally a steam shovel with the same confounded question, "Are you my mother?" My own loitering birdman on the path, in fact, bore uncanny resemblance to the book's fledgling. Yet in his case, while his matted gray hair stuck out like pin feathers, he would chirp, "Ahoy, Captain! Are you my captain?" "No, I am not your captain," I should have said. I was and would admit to being captain of nothing, if not my tent, so I would help him carry his nautical mood no further. And I'm going to skip a section. He tries to climb into my tent, and I threaten him with the book I'm holding, and then I talk about the book that I'm reading, which is a Will Self collection of stories. One of the stories is titled Inclusion, and I talk about that story. Basically, it's about a drug that makes people go manic, and it sucks things into their head, kind of like this gravitron or centrifuge or something. And it made me feel like, because I was reading that story at the time, that guy was being sucked into my tent because I was reading the story about guys who could suck people into his head. So anyway, it's kind of an odd experience. And then so I pack up my stuff. As soon as he leaves, I pack up my stuff and get on the ferry. But as we leave Dover, we cannot leave Fred Harrison behind, unshaved, as he searches the darkness. So let the visitor trip again as we double back over the magic carpet folds. Although the carpet's surface is green, it has cracked at the folds, revealing dirty white gaps. The carpet has sprouted older buildings, radar towers, people, and sheep. And it also blooms with bombs planted by the Germans. They first bloomed upon oil storage facilities, industrial plants, ports, and aerodromes. Fortunately, they were not carpet bombs, since carpet bombing refers to bombing method, layer thrown down upon layer, rather than bomb type. The bombing was more scattershot than concentrated, as the Luftwaffe often moved onto the next manufacturing plant or target before disabling or destroying the first, not unlike the feeding pattern of butterflies. I'm skipping a couple parts. It's back to Harrison in the tunnels. He crouched on the floor, and he's searching for his shaving brush. He crouched on the floor, and his boots creaked. Harrison felt along the floor tiles. Their rough texture surprised him. Sweeping his fingers over the tile squares in wide arcs, the radius of his arm length, he shuffled and creaked toward where he thought the brush had fallen and rolled. He swept and inched, and then he swept and inched in the other direction until he cracked his head on the sink, cursing. And he continued feeling along the tiles, along the whole row of sinks, under them. He scratched his back. He snatched his hand back. It felt like a rat, some kind of animal that his fingertips grazed before he knew it was the badger bristles, and that he'd found it. There were rats here, he wasn't crazy. Taking up the brush, he went hand over hand from basin to basin until he found his own with his kit. This wouldn't do in the dark, he thought, and he packed up his kit to search for any kind of light. A good minute, it seemed, to swing his toe to the door frame, and then he stepped the length of the corridor, tentative along the side he knew was less likely to bash his shin with a rolling chair. He pawed the surface of a desk he reached, hoping for something he could use, matches, anything. He went to the next room along the tunnel, guiding himself near the wall with his fingertips dragging along the surface of it as it arched overhead, its curve like the parabola of an incoming German shell. He fingered the electrical conduit above his head there, dead lamp fixtures marking the distance he passed. The voices grew louder now, nearer a hub of activity. Perhaps the next room had radar plotting, a map table with a telephone rigging suspended above it, or it would be the one after next. The underground hospital started a few tunnels over. There were plans already afoot to expand the tunnel, add 2 more levels, and it was easy enough to get lost as it was. Without light, it seemed he had to learn it all over again. Harrison towed his way through the room, knocking another desk, a substantial one, searching its surface, careful not to muss the papers, and there, next to the ridged hexagonal pencil, something hard, heavy with batteries. Yes, he switched it on. An electric torch, thank God. The room took on a completely different spatial aspect in the light, shrinking and simplifying the space he'd struggled through, giving him some personal embarrassment that he was glad would remain in the tunnel. A few dozen paces, and a matter of seconds had him back in the laboratory with a glorious beam. By his watch, 20 minutes stood between him and the train to London, where his sweet wife waited in the flat with their tiny daughter in her arms. If he caught the train and it was on time, he would be able to spend almost all of his 48-hour leave with them. He set the torch on an adjacent sink and ran the hot tap at full throttle, imagining he was one of the lucky chaps at the controls of a Spitfire, prop clawing into the sky, coursing the water into the basin and then sending up steam when it was good and hot. He wondered, as he shaved, how such a humdrum act, when there was a war on, could bring such joy. To me, shaving with a straight razor was enough of a feat in itself, let alone performing it in adverse conditions. From the sharp line of his pencil mustache, Harrison looked like he still took care and skill to shave well, even into his early 90s. In fact, on the very morning he was telling me this story, there I was, staring at a mustache and daydreaming about its past, a past I felt that I had lived because I had walked on top of it, read about it, and because he told it well. Good thing I eventually found an electric torch. But my razor hand must have been shaking like all get out, because in the half-dark I nicked my ear. Boy, my right ear smarted as though the very flames of hell had licked it when I boarded that train to London. I tell you, chap, those tunnels were deep, but not that deep, thank the Lord. But once that train was rolling, I was fast asleep. To hear Harrison tell it 67 years after the fact, I wondered if the entire war had been for him a charming adventure of minor inconvenience, optimism, and proper grooming. While Harrison slept, the train propelled him and its other, mostly military, passengers away from Dover's war apparatus and shell-splintered buildings. The steel wheels hiss and hush on steel rail, coasted them over land, easily mistaken for peaceful. This was the impression the government preferred the public to believe. Rolling in all the cinemas, before ticket holders could escape into the feature picture, the Ministry of Information unreeled its dream of how well their fellow Brits were holding up. While Harrison's train bore his sleeping body to London, citizens were treated to the front line, Dover, 1940. As perky trumpets play their battle call, the credits announce, Dover, to 15th December 1940, after 3 months as frontier town. The reel opens with explosions of what happens to be a nighttime air raid upon the harbor. A confident male voice chimes in. All of Britain is on the front line, but someone has got to bear the brunt of it. Other short clips follow, showing geometric formations of German fighters and bombers flying overhead, showing townsfolk waiting in the street and going about their business. The voiceover introduces a figure standing at the railing, the mayor of Dover, overlooking the harbor. The mayor turns back to the camera and says, Although Dover is the front line, it is not a mass of ruins. Dover is quite all right. The voiceover narrator concurs by offering his own equally thorough statistical assessment. Yes, Dover is all right. It looks intact. The town's still there. The harbor's still there. And later in the film, after they've seen vignettes of happy citizens sleeping in underground shelters, dealing with nightly blackouts, air raids, and a newsstand closing up shop so the vendor can work an additional shift as an ambulance driver, The narrator does admit that people are dealing with some small amount of hardship. Of course, with all this happening, Dover hasn't escaped untouched, although the damage is amazingly small. In this film, we learn that a denial and downplay of real suffering, hardship, and vulnerability will be the best way to win this war. The narrator drives home this implied lesson. The key of Britain is strong because its people are strong. The fact that they look across at Germany doesn't scare them a bit. The film diminishes the trauma of war by domesticating it. After the same fashion that the English have tamed and trimmed nature in their ornamental gardens, with classification and conspicuous order, the filmmakers compose a surreal montage of RAF dogfighting action shots, juxtaposed with still scenes of wrecked planes and war carnage that seem to have been planted and sprung up from the verdant fields. And behind the front line in the Garden of England, life goes on normally. The hop pickers are as busy and cheery as ever, while the dogfights spar and wheel overhead. The Garden of England is growing a new crop. Messerschmitts, Heinkels, Dorniers, Junkers, dramatic pause, and pilots. The camera cuts to the crumpled wreckage of each, showing how quickly a diabolical engine of destruction can be made harmless as a haystack once it is transplanted into a pastoral setting. As if any farmer would be proud to bring that smoldering produce to market. The black and white format saves the viewer from the full impact of German gore. And more striking for its absence, the film shows no footage of destroyed British materiel or life, despite the fact that through that point, September 16, a day after the date on the film, the battle had brought total operational losses of British aircraft to 577 Hurricanes and 340 Spitfires, not to mention the hundreds of men who had died fighting. The Brits documented or performing in the film exemplify keeping a stiff upper lip, even as some appear to be reading from cue cards and reciting lines. Near the end of the film, the narrator concludes, "The Battle of Britain is being won by the spirit of the people. Let war-scarred Dover have the last word." A housewife comes out, hand in a pocket of her apron, to stand in the doorway of her home and answer the narrator's voiced-over question. "Well, Mrs. McEwen, are you leaving Dover?" She replies, "What? For that Herr Hitler? No fear. If they wants us to go, they've got to throw us out. But still, you're wasting my time. I've got my dinner to cook. Goodbye." With a cheery wave, she returns inside her domestic life. By the war's end, just counting Dover, there would be 216 civilian deaths and 760 injured, complemented by the damage of 10,056 buildings, 957 completely destroyed. But what good are numbers in themselves? Images form and figure experience. They shape our stories more than cold, faceless numbers ever do. Propagandists count on images, on the stories they can project. We can guess that many on the train to London with Frederick Harrison had seen that film, taken it in like they'd absorbed the other films, and maybe taken for granted. The more films they watched about the events in their own lives, the harder it was to know where their own stories stopped and another stories began. A man serving the Royal Navy who'd been granted leave on the same interval as Harrison had boarded the same train and was moving through the cars from front to back, looking first for fellows he knew, and then, failing that, for an open compartment with room to stretch out. The Navy man probably saw that this car was largely deserted, save for a couple nurses reading magazines and a train conductor of some sort playing solitaire. The Navy man, we'll call him Jennings, walked past them, looking for a place to set down his bag, moving past seats stacked with luggage and an outsized chunk or two of souvenir debris looted from downed Nazi aircraft. And then a few open seats, where he tossed his things, sat, and unfolded yesterday's newspaper. In some of those articles, it was hard to know what to take for truth, unless they gave you some quantification, real numbers. But even those were often estimates, like there, for instance, the strength of the Luftwaffe. And the words themselves had spin, bowled at you like a cricket ball with an off-spin delivery. Try defending your home wicket against that. The corner of his eye caught something slumped in the next seat and across the aisle. Jennings leaned forward for a better angle and saw that it was a man in uniform. the Queen's Royal Regiment. The rustling paper hadn't roused him. Jennings cleared his throat, loudly, to no effect. He came closer, and his heart jumped. The man's throat was gashed, and blood ran across it in a wide swath and into the seat cushions. Dead as a sandbag. Like Wallace, Bohay, Mackay, and poor old Arthur Smith. All just this summer, the ones he knew. Dozens more if he let thoughts of them escape. And here was this man, who happened to look a bit like his captain, but dead. That impression may have brought a few licks of Walt Whitman to his mind, as it does to mine. I bet Jennings knew the last two stanzas by heart. "O captain, my captain, rise up and hear the bells. Rise up, for you the flag is flung, for you the bugle trills." I have some more of that, or the two stanzas. Ends with, "Exult, O shores, and ring, O bells, but I with mournful tread walk the deck, my captain lies, fallen cold and dead." The body lolled with the rocking train. How long ago was he attacked? And whoever killed him, a German spy, was likely still on the train. They were almost to London, and then the spy would be loose. The blood and color was drained from the man's face, and the neck blood was starting to dry. Jennings reached out to test what heat remained in the body, in the man's cheek. And that's when the body moved. Jennings jumped back and emitted a low, involuntary "Wah!" The body woke and sat up straight, mirroring the Navy man's alarm. "Good Lord, you gave me just a start there. You gave me a start just there," Jennings said. "I wasn't sure if you were to get off in London or to continue on into the smoke." He pointed to the blood he could see better now, as having dribbled from Harrison's ear and across his neck. Jennings fumbled with a polished chrome Zippo, which reflected Harrison's apparent ownership of a partially severed head. The surprising amount of blood felt sticky about Harrison's neck. He pulled out his handkerchief to wipe it off and looked at his faint reflection in the window, searching for more blood as he wiped it off. "I thought you'd been done in, I did." Jennings' face still wore concern. Harrison laughed, introduced himself, and cleaned his neck, getting the dried patches with some spittle. Then his eyes focused farther out on the window into the city he had difficulty recognizing, peering into occasional shattered buildings, some bombed out just the night before. Steam and smoke rose from structures that bombs had blown open, houses, shops, factories, churches, and figures scrambled about them to extinguish flames. Maybe this was what really worried Jennings, that life and death was a matter of chance, that every moment showed them this war was going to be more awful than they'd ever imagined, and that every day brought Germany closer to invading Britain by land. As the train kept rolling into the heart of the city, Harrison saw that several restaurants and every pub that slid past the window was open and looked busier than ever. "London already," Harrison said. "I must have slept like the dead." Jennings grabbed Harrison by the elbow. "Well, nothing restores one to life like a good ale. Let me stand you a pint." He grinned like a hero. Harrison felt logy from his nap, and seeing craters in the streets rattled him, setting him to wonder the odds of a bomb having fallen off target, like so many had, to obliterate the flats that sheltered his small family. So just this once he prayed the German bombers would be more accurate. The raids only came at night. He should rush home. But if they hadn't slept in the shelters, or if they hadn't made it there in time or for some trifling reason, then he didn't know what he'd do. He'd need a pint of courage, or more, to face that. It's hard to turn down a free beer at the start of leave, especially when you've let a man think, just for a moment, that he's wakened you from death. So Harrison slapped him on the back and said, "I'll drink one to your health, even if it does pour out me neck." In Britain, throughout the war, beer would never be rationed. I'll stop there.